So the last thought process for the afternoon is really connection, and we've seen quite a bit of that early on in the day, what Matt talked about, certainly the very important stuff that Grant was saying about the habitat as far as Major Mitchell cockatoos is concerned, and Tim, some of his connection stuff with the talking about the developments and how you can retain some sort of continuity across the landscape, and what you can do it in places like golf courses. Other places it's obviously a lot more difficult. But there is, I guess, started to develop in a couple of different pockets over in Adelaide, talks about we tend to act in isolation with all this. And I think it's important that we start to change that. I'll have a look at the historical approach a little bit, just from an arboricultural perspective. We'll go back to natural bushland. We often, when we talk about corridors, talk about it on a landscape scale. Very few of you in this room are going to look at this on a landscape scale. You might look at it on a street scale. You might look at it on a park scale. But we can look at it, if we can think about it across the continuum, we can start to make some differences and what difference that might make to wildlife. So firstly, tree management. When I first started speaking to the arborists at TreeNet, right, what is it you actually do? How can I help in relation to the wildlife? I found that very much it was, what does this tree need? What does this tree need? We were looking at trees as individual entities, which they are, but not as part of a continuum across the landscape. Not just how does this tree affect that and the other. Now, very much, one of the exciting aspects to me today was the stuff Matt's talking about. The soil structure, the microbes and the organisms living there is as much or more part of the health of that tree as anything we've been considering until now. Part of the wildlife that we're looking at, by being able to retain hollows and create connectivity, is really important. That doesn't say anything that health, conformation, risk mitigation, which is huge parts of your job, won't continue to be the priority. But if we could also incorporate into that, how do we retain these other elements and how can we look at the landscape in a slightly different way, I think that'll be very important. So, as we look at the landscape, again, this is bushland about 100 metres from my place. You've got the large trees, and there is connectivity all through this landscape, from canopy to canopy, from larger trees to smaller trees and shrubs, and from those shrubs down onto the ground. Now that connectivity occurs both vertically and horizontally in a natural forming landscape. Typically in our urban landscape, it occurs when it occurs horizontally through the landscape, but it tends not to occur anywhere near as commonly in a vertical conformation. We remove many of these smaller shrubs and trees in urban parks for concerns about safety and other issues, but there are real benefits in having them. They don't just have to be in urban parks, they can be in other locations, so we'll come back to that. But really the key thing is, as Matt said and numerous other people have said today, we can't consider this entity in isolation if you're looking at it from a wildlife perspective. Yes, there are highly mobile organisms, birds and bats, that will find it regardless of where it is, but there are many other species that won't be able to utilise it. Possums will really struggle to climb that because it's too large for them to get up, or most of them, unless there is some real craggy branches or something that he can access, whereas a koala would have no trouble coming up against that. So what I would really ask you take away from this session, if nothing else, stop looking at a tree just as an entity you need to manage by itself. How does it form part of the larger landscape? Okay, so that landscape that I was talking about from a natural bushland, we have these large trees, we have smaller trees, shrubs, right down to ground cover and leaf litter. All of them form part of a continuum. And the biodiversity, from the microbes right through to the powerful owls, are taking advantage of aspects of that, or the connectivity of that. One of the things we do in urban environments is strip out some of that complexity. And when we strip out the complexity, we don't know the repercussions of that, which is why we are seeing so many wildlife species suffering. If we can take a little more time, think about it a little more, that process might start to reverse, or at least stabilise. And I think stabilising it would be very important. Now, I had a quick look on Google Maps because I wanted to find somewhere where there was examples of really good connectivity and really poor connectivity and the variation in between. And just going along the Yarra River, it was pretty obvious. I'm not sure of what part of Melbourne this is, but it's just somewhere in the east, I think. And you can see right along here, yes, there are small plantings here, but there's breaks all the way through here, and virtually arboreal mammals like possums, etc., can make their way through virtually without going to ground. And up these streetscapes and around these parks, there is really good connectivity. On the other side of the river, the same thing occurs, really good connectivity. But in the industrial estates, you're doing well to find a tree. Not that that's surprising, or not that we're looking to change that, but it's just appreciating the assets where they exist and trying to safeguard them for aesthetic reasons, the wildlife that can find their way to them, and the other amenity values like clean air. Interestingly, I would also think this is probably more well-to-do suburbs. This is probably less well-to-do suburbs. Much smaller blocks, the plantings are less so. There is certainly green space coming down through here, but it's nowhere near as connected. It's much more fragmented. But even in those spaces where it is connected, we create much better corridors for the movement of wildlife and the persistence of wildlife, which goes back to some of the aspects I mentioned earlier on in the other talk. So connectivity. Many of the older properties, and there's a house here, many of the older properties covered somewhere between, and certainly in the more affluent parts of any of the major capital cities you're in around Australia, as long as you're outside the inner belt, covered somewhere between 30 and 40, maybe 45% of the block. What we're seeing more and more often occur is a similar size block, and this house is now covering 60% of the block. There are other implications for us from a health perspective. The heat transfer and the urban heat island effect. When you've got a black roof, you've got no vegetation to take some of that heat away, absorb some of that energy and convert the oxygen. Much hotter, much more difficult, far less wildlife can occur there. And it goes even further. Historically, this would have been a block like this that's been subdivided, 2 properties. You're talking about 90% of the available space being taken up, and you've got a little bit of lawn and an odd palm tree here. So unless, both from a planning perspective and from a management of our urban environment perspective, start to appreciate the value of having connectivity here, we've got some really big challenges within our cities, and wildlife more so. Moving out to the peri-urban areas, there are still challenges. Fortunately, there is a lot more native bushland available. And within that, often the builds are more sympathetic, but more and more often, some of those builds, things like farmland, which has been there forever, but as we've heard a number of times today with Melbourne expanding and where new growth corridors are taking place, these areas are very much becoming urban developments. And while these have few trees, certainly the urban development I saw in the hour drive from the airport yesterday and some of the things I saw this morning, easier and cheaper to clear all those trees before we get started. There might be a few really significant trees that stay, but the cost benefit to those builders is they don't have to manage that potential downside. What we really need to start considering is what the upside is. Having that connectivity across the landscape, be it walking trails, riding trails, places for bikes, but that can connect to parks, has a real benefit. And unless we start to look at the landscape slightly differently, we're going to be in a situation that we'll regret within 20 or 30 years. And really importantly, properties are not islands. This is a demonstration park in Adelaide, and it was put in specifically to show the residents what sort of plants they could plant, how effective it can be. Many councils do that, and it's really excellent, but I think there's another advantage to it. When we were walking through there and had numerous discussions, there were large trees in this particular park, and there's water also in the park, and we'll come back to that in a second. But many of these trees had no understory. You actually had to go to the neighbouring houses that had mid-sized trees or larger shrubs that actually got connectivity to those large trees. So while by itself an urban house cannot attract the wildlife it wants to, if it is able to align with creek plantings, council parks, linear parks of various sorts, you aggregate the assets and you get greater than the sum of the two parts. We hear about many people who will join backyards to share produce, be it fruit trees or veggie gardens or that sort of thing. There have also been starting to talk about backyards getting together to try and take advantage of wildlife, because if we all join the corner of our backyards, we actually have a much bigger space, we can attract more species. And often parks that are done for biodiversity are really exemplars across the landscape. And we have a few houses across the suburbs that put in primarily native, and many other people put in virtually whatever they want. I never in any of my presentations tell anyone what they have to do, but if we can get 20 or 30% native plantings within the context of those backyards, it can really change what the wildlife might look like, particularly if it's couched in a context that you're not a backyard by yourself. Look over your fence. Okay, maybe you can't have I don't know, a 20, 25 metre eucalypt in your backyard, but you've got a park across the way that can. If we add more structure to that, so small trees, large shrubs, small shrubs, ground cover, etc., we can attract and maintain more wildlife across the city. And of course, water catchment areas are often built along exactly those lines. We want to clear the water before we have to get rid of it quickly, and it also provides a whole range of plant species, from large eucalypts down to club rushes and sedges and reeds and all the rest of it. So if you have aspects and you're part of the council like that close to you, how can the residents be encouraged to take advantage of that and in essence add to it, because your biodiversity will increase? Very few locations around the city, many more locations in peri-urban environments, have significant water bodies, but having any water is an advantage. And the closer you are to water, the more likely you are to have higher wildlife. So again, tying in one to another. If you can't do it, but you have it in your neighbourhood, take advantage of it. And really interestingly, this particular property, quite an affluent property or a location in Adelaide, was across the park from across the road from a park. And although you can't see it in this picture, these trees went close to joining. Really interestingly, as we look at the landscape, historically we used to have wire fences. They've been changed to brick or galv or brush fences, none of which provide an opportunity for wildlife to live in, live on and move through the landscape. These older fences, and we would plant for privacy because the wire fences didn't do, mesh wire fences didn't do what we wanted to do. All of this, and you'll find in your older suburbs, you have more wildlife because the structure, while it's not the same as in bushland, but is replicated in a similar way to what you see in bushland. And being able to maintain and keep some of that is invaluable. The park that's across the way, half of it was an exemplar park where they planted native species, and half was a place where you'd run around, had a playground with kids, dog park, all that sort of thing. So the council were using that area to try and educate the public that actually these two things work really well side by side. It doesn't have to be one or the other, and these are the reasons for it. It ended up winning state awards in the end. And there are other assets that you can either, if you're a local council, you can educate your constituents about, or you can take advantage of if you're in the industry. I'm sorry, I didn't realise that DEPI had changed names, but your environment department does have some good information on the sorts of wildlife that are going to be around, how you can manage some of that wildlife. There is information from NRM boards or catchment boards, Trees for Life, other conservation organisations, and lots of councils do provide their own literature that try and educate the public. In this particular case, I think there was a combination of what plants you can put in your backyard, what are weeds, and they were actually encouraging native planting on the verge. So there is one council in Adelaide that has lots and lots of native planting rather than a dust bowl in summer and sporadic grass in winter. They actually have lots of little native shrubs, etc. on the verge, and it looks just great. Just one council area does it in Adelaide. All right, so connectivity is really important, and I was thinking about that more from the larger landscape scale. I'd like to change now and talk about a single project we did with one of the councils in Adelaide, Unley City Council. It's an inner city council. It's probably our most affluent council in Adelaide, and if not first, it'd be second. It was the one I was talking about that only has 2.5% green space. So wherever possible, they're looking to try and attract wildlife, and much of that wildlife is at least 2 cities away between them and the hills and the wildlife beyond. As you look down this particular corridor, it looks like it's a really leafy green suburb, and aspects of it are. But all of these elms had been pruned significantly twice, and there was failure. They were looking like they were going to fall. There was lots of targets. There were cars parked all along here. People would traverse here all the time, and the council was really concerned about it. And they said, okay, what are we going to do? They got a new water sensitive urban design. Great, let's go ahead. And as soon as they started to go ahead, quite a number of the residents said, what are you going to do about the wildlife in those trees? And really interestingly, the council arborists that had to manage this project were concerned about what they wanted to do. So the council got me in and asked me to survey and assess the trees, see what we were dealing with, what our options were. When we look at a schematic that was produced by the designer of the water sensitive urban design, that original photograph was taken from about here. So as you can see, while there is a really dense avenue of trees down here, it's not dense at all down there. So what looked really leafy and green all the way down actually was certainly not the case on the northern side, which is this side. And very few of these trees was there connectivity between them. The other thing, if you look in between the properties, yes, that went in about 20 or 30 metres, but it didn't go very far, the green space, and hardly any options for wildlife to spread out was available on the northern side. Whereas on the southern side, up the front here, okay, they could actually find their way all the way around here. There was a big space that they could ingress. They could work all the way through here, and then there were sections all the way through here. There were opportunities. But these were the trees that we had to take out. And this was the healthy end. This was actually just half of the street. The other half was down there. They became more sporadic, and the connectivity wasn't there at the other end of the street. So what were we going to do? The first thing we did was actually survey the hollows. And of the 33 trees that were there, I think I managed to survey 24 of them. We couldn't get to some of the others because cars were underneath them and budget ran out and all the rest of it. But that gave us a really good idea. Of those 24 trees, there are about 125 hollows that we could count within those trees. Something like 75 of those hollows, or 61%, were large enough to take vertebrates. So they could be bats, could be birds, could be possums. 70% of those that were big enough too had actively been used relatively recently. And on the day, which was in summer when we did it, on the day, 26% of them, but it was after the breeding season, so it was late breeding season, 26% of them actually had resident wildlife in them. Okay, so that include, oh sorry, it was during the breeding season, not after the breeding season. One of the recommendations was we take them out after the breeding season. So a quarter of the hollows that were available actually had wildlife in them. And the wildlife that we anticipated we could get was owls, Certainly that was one of the lorikeets that was there. Wood duck, we found 2 wood duck nests. Pardalotes, we didn't find any, nor did we find any bats, but certainly they were possible. But the biggest issue was going to be the possums, because if we do it outside of the breeding season, we're likely to see many more birds, and they're highly mobile. But as we've already discussed, the possums were highly territorial. We did it together with the council street crew, and in wildlife arboreal management, there's going to be a tremendous amount of variability depending on the species you're dealing with, access you're going to get, etc. But also what the client wants and what the crew's motivations are. The client, the council, really wanted to look good. This was potentially for them a PR disaster if there were residents there that were able to take photos of possums going through chippers. Okay? They're a really affluent community that were very wildlife conscious. And indeed, the crew was really motivated. The crew really didn't want to harm any of the wildlife if they possibly could. So we had a best case scenario. That's not always going to be the case. Unfortunately, other than some work up in Queensland about actually extracting wildlife, there's very little I could find about managing wildlife. We'd done one project before, but it was nowhere near as big as this. So we drew up some plans about how we were going to do it, and we implemented it. Obviously, the removal of those trees was going to have a tremendous impact on the wildlife concern. I think we counted... There were 4 ring-tailed possums in the final count that we managed, and there were 14 or 15 brush-tailed possums, and we did it at a time of year when the wildlife wasn't going to be there. But our biggest concern around the possums was the lack of connectivity. So on a really local scale, these are highly territorial animals that don't move very far. Some work done in Victoria back in the 90s found that if a brush-tailed possum is translocated, something like 90% of them are dead within 4 weeks, whether it's good possum habitat or not. And that's because they don't know the environment they've been moved into. So around the country, translocation of possums has become illegal, or at worst frowned upon as a consequence. So that whole connectivity aspect is really important, even down to a street level. The survey recommendations as a consequence were we were going to remove those trees between March and June. The reason we chose between March and June, the likelihood of there being any nesting other than with rainbow lorikeets outside of the breeding season was very slim. We were going to retain, out those 33, I said ideally I'd like 8 elms. We ended up compromising and we kept 6 in the top end of the road where there was best connectivity. And they did that because that enabled us to release some of the possums we caught. Otherwise, most of them were going to have to be euthanized. And that worked really well. We needed permits and we needed to convince the state government that we had the wildlife handling capabilities to manage it, and in the end they were really happy with it and ended up using it as a best case scenario. It took about half a day to train the tree crew, and they knew exactly what they needed to do, and we'd report in once every day, but they were much more comfortable in the role they did. They said early on it took about 40% more time, but by the time they were finished and knew what they were doing, it was probably 20% more time. But they knew the animals were safe, it was better managed, the community was really happy with the outcome. So there was no negative on the council as a consequence. The only thing that I didn't recommend, because it didn't even cross my mind, but the arborist thought, was poison the elms so they don't sucker once they're cut, etc. But the benefit of that, when we came to do it, it meant it was much quicker, there was less connectivity between the trees, it was easier to actually acquire and contain the animals and then move them on. And as Pat said, what we would tend to do is go through, identify, literally using cameras and torches, where the possums were. We would confine possums to a space of no more than that, and we would take out sections of tree, drop it to the ground, and we would either release it later in the day, if it's one of the animals that could be released, or it would be taken to a veterinary surgeon and ethically euthanized. So the council was really pleased about that. The local community was really pleased about that, and the tree crew were much more comfortable as a consequence. So I guess in conclusion, what would be fantastic if we're able to broaden our concept of tree management. Okay, you're dealing with one tree at a time, but we are collectively dealing with the landscape, and that's really important when we look at it from a wildlife perspective. So that connectivity, be it across the landscape or be it across the street, is really, really important. And it might be just a backyard, or it might be one park, it might be one street. But that connectivity, look at it in a different way, because that has tremendous benefit for the wildlife that is under your management. And that wildlife really enhances the value of the trees. We get a lot more out of them. The trees get more out of them by that relationship they have with the wildlife. And it's not just a council, it's not just an arborist issue, it's all our responsibility. If I have a backyard or I use a street, knowing about those assets and how else I can enhance that environment takes the pressure off one group or another. Collectively, we all have it. So if you can look at the environments you're working in slightly differently, I think there's some fantastic outcomes that could come from it. Thank you.
Okay, questions?
We're done.
No, I'll go on. I'll throw one in.
Matt's got a question, surprise me.
How do we get developers to start to embrace this sort of stuff? I worked in Boston for a few years, and some of the most affluent suburbs that I worked in over there were suburbs where they were embracing this with no fence policies and just the way that they considered the footprint of where they were going to put the houses. You know, no one wanted to look at each other's backyard or front yard or back door. So, you know, obviously they were big, expensive houses, but it's doable, and people love those suburbs, and that was the sales pitches. You know, you don't have to look at your neighbour. You actually look at your neighbour's backyard, which makes you feel like you own acres and acres of land, and then then you've got all the connectivity as well. And the way we're going,
we're strangling ourselves. We don't realise it, because our privacy is so important.
Yeah.
It does astound me when I hear someone complaining about a two-storey house going up some. They can see into my backyard. Frankly, what happens in your backyard is not that interesting. But I understand their concern. There's also a suburb up in Brisbane, an entire subdivision up in Brisbane, where they built it nestled into a national park, but no pets were allowed. They did it really environmentally friendly, and what happened was 2 other subdivisions came and built in with no regulation on the back of that, promoting the wildlife, and those other subdivisions decimated the really good work that had been done in the first one. I don't have an answer for that. I mean, that's much clever political brains.
Is it something we should be doing as an inter-industry thing? You're starting to...
Yeah, I don't.
Anyway,
I don't. Look, I think that's a great question. Certainly don't have an answer there.
Going back a step earlier to your conversation, Dave, habitat boxes you're selling a fly version,
yep,
versus a natural one, the natural log strapped into the tree. Benefits, flaws, against. One's easier to make, I know that.
One's a lot easier to make. One's a lot more cost effective to make, sustainable sources, that sort of thing. The bottom line is one's actually really easy to construct and put in for the general public. Yes. Okay, you have access to stuff that you can put up. I guess the other thing that has been my concern and been flagged by a number of arborists is we're putting insults on trees. The larger the insult you put on the tree, the more potential risk there is. So a big, heavy log being put up a tree is more difficult, it takes greater attachment, and much of what I do is for someone in the backyard who's climbing up like I originally was with a ladder. So I wanted to do it as safely and efficiently as possible. So
there's nothing in the thermal mass of either.
Look,
there's not a good enough argument for it.
The thermal mass, because you're tending to put boxes or hollows like that, again on the east or southeast side of a tree, you're using the natural protection of the canopy and the bole of the tree to minimise any solar impact, to also minimise any weather impact. Yes, the thicker the thermal mass, the greater the chances it will remain stable for longer, but we have any of these long periods and it's going to be the same anyway. I guess it's cost and it's speed at the end of the day, and efficiency is why I would do one over the other, although I think the natural hollows look far more attractive.